Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. One of our viewers, Graham, asked that I make a video talking a little bit about how I learn, how I get information, and in particular, how to filter information. He gave a quote from the famous Naval Ravikant. If you're interested, you can check him out on Twitter, or there's a book called The Almanac of Naval Ravikant, which somebody has basically compiled a whole bunch of tweets, interviews, articles, etc. of Naval's collective wisdom, and has put it together into a book. So feel free to check that out. He's got thoughts on many things. Anyway, he mentioned how Naval had discussed that throughout most of history, having information was scarce, so having more information gave you an edge. And in the modern day, there's too much information, so learning to filter down information gives you an edge. Today I'm going to talk about some of my philosophies around learning, accelerating your learning, ending up in a position where you can filter through kind of signal from noise, and making efficient use of your time in gaining mastery. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. If you'd like help with the subjects we deal with here, we deal with global international solutions for you, custom made, bespoke to you, not based on some generic nonsense that somebody is sending out there, but actually what you need in your life. This includes figuring out the best solution of where to live, how to set up your international structure, how to optimize your taxes, protect your assets, do banking, etc. Working with companies like Amazon, stores, drop shippers, affiliates, investors, etc. around the world. And not just the strategy, but also helping you to implement. So if those things are interesting to you, please reach out to us. You can book a call with me, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or send a message through offshorecitizen.net. Okay, lots to talk about on this subject of learning. So I'm somebody who clearly values lifelong learning. You know, I share information out here, hopefully to help people who are interested in learning as well. And I would say a fairly significant portion of my day, every day, is contributed to learning. I think Warren Buffett made some great comments about how learning or reading, we can kind of blur the two a little bit, has a compounding effect. That you just learn a bit every day, and over time it adds up quite a lot. And it's interesting how many topics you could learn quite a lot and improve quite a lot just with a relatively small input of time. I'll give you an example of one that I'm going to do over the next little while. My photography skills are not great. And I was talking to my wife saying, I have like the boyfriends of Instagram sort of syndrome where I often have to take photos for my wife. It's like, you know what, probably just like a 4-hour course would improve my photography skills really substantially. Like it doesn't take that much to make a pretty big difference. So why aren't people doing it? And I think this is true for many, many topics. There's something called the 20-hour rule. There's a TED Talk on it showing that most of the gains you get in a lot of fields come in the first 20 hours. So if you figure 20 hours, that's like, you could easily do that per month. If you did one skill per month, you can do 12 skills in a year and you end up really far ahead. Similarly, Mark Cuban observed years ago, there's all this information in these books there for the taking. Anyone can get it, but most people don't go and get it. And I think that's really poignant to just how people approach life. People tend to go through life probably being more social than being more learning, and obviously socialization is really important. Entertainment, enjoyment, etc. is important, but it can also be fun to learn, and it can be fun to take what you learn and share it with other people and get debates with them, and so on and so forth. So with that in mind, what are a few thoughts? I agree with Naval in the sense of kind of the filtration is important. I years ago kind of came up with this concept that the era after the information age is what I would call the age of meaning, meaning that you have to extract meaning from that overall information because there's too much of it, right? The connections between information, the relationships there, etc. And I've kind of refined that theory over time. Now, this being said, the founder of Multicoin Capital, Kyle, makes some really interesting points about efficiency versus effectiveness of information consumption. He says, I think that information consumption is very effective. I don't think it's necessarily very efficient. In fact, I think it's very inefficient, meaning that you sometimes have to consume a lot of information to find gems, but the value of those gems can be disproportionately high and justify all the rest. A little bit like angel investing, right? I personally don't totally subscribe to that, but I do think there is a lot to be said for this. Now, if you start to think from the standpoint of where do I collect good information, I think you can narrow this down and be fairly efficient pretty quickly. And the first is looking for things that are not what you have already consumed. I've noticed years ago that people would like to read books or watch films, etc., that kind of like confirm what they already know. And my approach was always to look for the things that I don't know, right? So say I was studying marketing or something. All right, show me the book that gives a different concept in marketing. And that just kind of expands your horizon. So in general, I think seeking out things that are different from what you know tends to be a rewarding exercise. Part of this is trying to identify independent thinkers. So for me, I'll look at a few people in my life, or the people that I follow on Twitter or channels that I follow, etc., and I'm paying attention to who are people who I respect as independent thinkers, and therefore they're going to come up with different perspectives than I would hear otherwise. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. That's not really the point. The point is that it's going to give me a different angle to consider for myself. Okay, so that's, I think, very useful. And it turns out that there are a certain set of people who give a much higher quality signal than other people. So I try to be that. I try to share high quality information with people who are out there on the internet, and hopefully you enjoy it and like it and learn something. And in the process, I try to synthesize information from others as well. Now, the thing that I think is maybe least talked about is that you learn in a circle. And so when I think about like, what are the things that people are not doing that help you to learn more effectively, I think, first of all, let's start with the learning in the circle. It was either Aristotle or Confucius, I can't remember, but one of them, who made the comment that there are three ways by which you obtain wisdom. The first is by imitation, which is easiest. The second is by reflection, which is noblest. And the third is by experience, which is bitterest. What I have observed is that the best process of learning involves a cycle of each of those three. So most people, I would say that imitation is the one that people probably put the most energy into. They kind of inadvertently get experience, which is actually doing it, right? So if you just think, what is imitation? Imitation is learning from others, right? If I watch a movie, if I read a book, if I, these are efficient ways of getting information because somebody else has gone through the learning process, synthesized, and able to give it to you. Definitely worth doing, right? Copying other people, learning from them, very worthwhile. Then there's actually doing. And actually doing gives you a level of understanding that you cannot get simply by learning from someone else. So in other words, how do you learn to swim? You don't jump into a pool after reading a whole bunch of books on it. Like you're probably going to drown. You need to actually get in the water, practice understanding buoyancy and things like this, learn to move in the water, learn how the water moves, how it pushes against you, etc., and operate accordingly. Same thing for riding a bike, right? You can't go get your PhD on riding a bike without riding a bike. It's all about getting on the bike. However, once you get on the bike, it can be very useful to take that experience and improve it by looking at what some other people have to say about how to do it better, right? This is the imitation part of it. Now, it turns out if you want to get quite a bit better, what you need to do is you need to take that and cycle it into reflection. So you need to kind of like reflect on what other people have said. You need to experience. Then you need to reflect on that experience. Then you need to go and get information about like other people's views on that. So cycling imitation, reflection, experience, very important, highly underrated. Okay, highly, highly underrated. Next, if you're in a situation where you are not surrounding yourself by other people who are involved in doing the same thing as you, then you're probably not learning nearly as quickly. So we can call this masterminding, whatever. It's a little bit different than imitation. It's not like having a coach. It's not like reading a book, etc. It's you're a part of a social circle who are going through this, and they are also reflecting, imitating, experiencing, and you can kind of be a part of that, and this is going to accelerate your learning quite a lot. So for me, for example, let's just say we're going to talk about investing. I have probably about like 5 or 6 people who I talk to regularly about the subject of investing. And I throw out ideas, they throw out ideas, they're going to challenge me, I'm going to challenge them. This is a great filtering process. I used to do this with online forums as like one environment if you're not around people. So that's another idea. Next, Probably it is very helpful for you to teach others. They say if you teach, you learn twice. And I think that trying to pass on information to someone is extremely useful in helping your own learning. It's maybe like one of the most underrated things in learning. Why? First of all, because you're forced to conceptualize it in a structural way. You're forced to take the implicit and make it explicit. But second of all, what you're going to find is they're not going to get it the way that you do. And it's going to force you to reprocess it. I remember I studied magic, like card manipulation, things like this back in the day. And I was sitting with a friend one time doing a one-handed pivot cut. I'll show you guys sometime. And anyway, to me, I was just like, oh yeah, you just go like this. And it wasn't working for him. He's like, oh, maybe my hands are too small. And I'm like, no, that doesn't seem right. And eventually what we saw was that I was doing this thing where I was tilting the one half of the deck slightly. I wish I'd kind of brought a deck of cards I should show you. But anyway, I was tilting the one portion of the deck, and it allowed the one portion to move around the other. For me, it was just automatic, but until he had that problem, I didn't even know to comment on it. And I think that's really useful. I wrote some books back in the day where, as I was learning, I would write. And I think it's really good to document because years later, once you've already learned it, you take for granted a lot of the little lessons you learned at the time. So very, very helpful to be able to do that. The last thing which I find is highly underrated is building mental models. And I've heard Bill Gates does this. You'll hear Charlie Munger talk about this quite a lot. I find it works super well for me. And this is a notion that memorization is a poor proxy for understanding. Understanding is sort of figuring out the causal chain of things, how the linkages work between one thing and another, all right? So it's one thing to sort of go and talk to people, hear information. It's another to go and kind of experience something and get information, or read a book and memorize something. These are all fine, right? There's some basis of a starting point. But I think if you want to accelerate your learning, if you want to accelerate your memorization, like so it's easier to recall things, it's easier to make sense of the world, it's easier to take that and make it functional. You want to build a mental model of how things work. And this requires reflection. This requires not doing experiential, it requires not reading, it requires sitting on your own, thinking about, okay, if this, then that, how does this work? Then going and trying something. Okay, how does that work? Interesting, go back here. So, and it's an iterative process that you go through. I think that is something that I see very rarely, and yet is hugely, hugely helpful. Along with this, you may apply another mental model, which is, how do you know, when something is mistaken, what is mistaken about it? So I think a lot of the times people tend to be like, that's wrong, that's right. It seems to me like not the greatest way, either socially to kind of engage with people, but also to improve yourself. If something is mistaken, it's going to be mistaken based on one of three things. The first one is the information is false. You can figure that out by getting to the root through some due diligence. So try to get as close to the actual thing as itself. This is a due diligence process, right? In other words, don't take what somebody says as a proxy for the actual thing. Try to get to the actual thing. As much as possible, go to the actual thing. Sometimes you can't, but the more you can do that, the better. And generally, the more you can surround with different, if you can't get to the thing, then surrounding it with many different positions will help you to have a better understanding, and you can kind of play them off each other to get a better perspective, right? So that's number one, is information is false. Number two is the information is true, but it's incomplete. So this is very often the case if we're talking about, say, complex systems, right? If I look at, for example, the economy, I might say, all right, I expect X, Y, Z to happen, and it doesn't happen. I can go back and I can say, well, hang on a minute, why did I think that would happen? Okay, well, here were my fundamental premises. Were the fundamental premises accurate? They might have been accurate, but they might have been incomplete. There might have been some other factors that I didn't include in there. And by including them all, I get a better picture of what's going to take place, right? A good example of this would be from an investment standpoint. You might say, okay, well, I'm going to look at the returns of a company based on their earnings. Okay, so I'm going to pay attention to, say, EBITDA. You can say, okay, great, I've got earnings before, EBITDA. of the company, and that's going to give me some idea of the valuation. But what I may not realize is that actually the EBITDA was manipulated through the way that they accounted for some sort of future revenue. This was the case with Enron, right? They would say, okay, we have these sales into the future, and those sales into the future, which may not be realized, we're going to book them today. And so what does this tell me? It tells me I probably want to look at the cash flow of the company as well. And you might say, okay, well, the cash flow is good. Why are the earnings bad? It's like, well, maybe you have share-based compensation or something, which might be booked as an expense. So the point is, this is just an example of where it's really, really useful if you can understand that what you have may be correct, but there may be other pieces missing, and then you can ask yourself, what might be missing, right? The third reason why something might be inaccurate is because the implication that you have from the fundamentals that you've broken down is inaccurate. Okay, I've seen this quite often where, for example, there's a very famous book written by C.S. Lewis called Mere Christianity, and he kind of tries to reason out a bunch of things. And he starts out with some really interesting principles, but then he takes these leaps, and you're like, well, hang on a minute, what happened here? This does not follow from this. And this is a hard standard to hold because you almost inherently have to make some leaps in order to draw some conclusions to take action on, because you probably can't perfectly reason from A to Z. However, it's worth understanding that this is a potential flaw and being able to point out, okay, was it that the underlying information was incorrect? And you can kind of challenge and examine that. 2, was it complete? You can challenge and examine that. Number 3, were the implications drawn from that information logically sound? And they might not be. So those are some things that I think about when I'm going through the process. I try to, mostly spend my time on a mixture of these and cycling. I don't do it super consciously. It's just sort of a natural process that, because I've built a social circle of people who are sort of interested in the same things, I can learn something, I can share it with them, I can go and try some things, I can share it with people, I can reflect on it. When people give me information, I can then reflect on it, then I can try it, etc. And that collectively ends up with a really, I find, quite functional and useful model, at least for me. So I would love to hear you guys' thoughts. Put them in the comments below, what it is that you find is helpful in the process of learning, and I will see you on the next video.